My name is Representative Pat Gardner. I'm here with my colleague, Senator Elena Parent, and we are here to tell you about some legislation that we intend to pre-file today. Actually, there are two pieces of legislation. I'm going to let a later speaker tell you about the details and why we are introducing two constitutional amendments. Just to let you know what's going to happen after you hear from me, from the House of Representatives, and from Elena Parent from the Senate, we'll hear from Brinkley Sidarkagist, who is with Common Cause, and then Kelly Person, who is with the League of Women Voters. We came together, the Georgia Redistricting Alliance, to bring together a number of people from the various organizations who were clearly upset about what happened in this election. There are a lot of things that happened that we can fight about, but what we know are the basis of our democracy are some words that I'm going to read to you, starting with what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence. He said that all men are created equal. We now say men and women. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The part that's not so commonly heard is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. After that, 1868, they came up with the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. It's part of the U.S. Constitution, and it says, no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. As we look at the way redistricting has been done in our state, we find that there is an increasing loss of sense of fairness. I came upon this partly because of the coalition, but also because I have constituents who are clamoring to make our system of elections fairer. I have two constituents here today if you're interested in talking to them. Matt Jordan's over here, Beth Berry is here, and I'm very proud to represent them as we carry forward this important message about what we do the next time redistricting comes. As you know, there's a census in 2020 that will determine how many districts we are eligible for, and will then draw maps for the entire states. We think we need a more independent process, so we have created a commission, an independent commission, to draw those maps. We also think that the standards that are sort of committee rules in both the House and Senate need to be in the law. In fact, there's a key phrase in each of the bills that I want you to pay attention to, and that is, the plan and districts shall not be drawn with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. Districts shall not be drawn with the intent or result of denying or abridging the equal opportunity of racial or language minorities to participate in the political process or to diminish their ability to elect representatives of their choice. We believe that those voters should elect their representatives. What has happened is representatives get together around a map and choose their voters. We don't think that's the way our founding fathers intended it, so we have a plan to make it more objective. I'm going to let Elena Parent tell you a little bit about why we think now is the right time.
Thank you, Representative Gardner. I began in the House, as many of you know, so of course she taught me everything I know over there. So she can't imagine that I, as one of her mentees, has moved on. Well, thank you all for being here this morning to address this very important topic. I think that, as Representative Gardner was explaining, the foundations of this movement rest in, number one, the notion that voters should pick their government and not the other way around, and also that the excesses of unfairly drawn districts that have been manipulated by partisan political interests and very specific map drawing are a very real threat to the functioning of our country. And I know that sounds dramatic, but I find it to be very true, and I think more and more people realize that something is amiss with our leaders being unable to come together to solve problems for the common good, of course have different perspectives, have disagreements, but ultimately solve problems. If you look at what we have now, what we basically have are more like warring teams. One, if it's in charge, wants to put in a whole slew of particular policies. The other, if it's in charge, wants to undo all of those policies and put in totally opposite policies. I'm exaggerating a little bit because certainly there are some areas where Congress and the parties have been able to work together, but in many ways it's not an exaggeration. You know, take a look at the Affordable Care Act. Well, we've got what's in place right now. If the rhetoric of the last 6 to 8 years and Representative Price, our new, potential Health and Human Services Secretary, holds true, all that will be completely undone. I don't believe this is how Americans want their government to function. I don't believe that the polar opposite opinions on this example of healthcare and the Affordable Care Act is actually truly representative of where the American people are, and a serious effort to solve problems that real Americans face in their everyday lives. And I lay some of the blame for this rhetoric on the drawing of, and subsequent policy, on the drawing of unfair districts. It is true that most congressional and state House and Senate districts in the country have been drawn very carefully to favor one political party or the other. As a result, we have most of our elections taking place in the primaries. In our General Assembly, we have 236 districts, of which, let's say it's even at 10 to 12, are competitive in a general election. That's max. When these maps were initially drawn after the 2010 census for the 2012 elections, they were drawn very specifically to achieve a 2/3 supermajority for one party, despite the fact that that party does not perform nearly that well in statewide elections. They may be a majority, but they're certainly not a 66% majority. These maps were drawn specifically to achieve a 66% majority. Only at that time, maybe 5 districts were competitive. The number has increased as, of course, the legislature cannot prevent people from moving and different things from happening as the years go by. However, you have seen some success out of the majority party to try to tweak district lines to prevent some of the competitiveness that has started to bubble up over the years. And that happened last session, and I know for a fact that the powers that be, it will not be lost on them that some districts are also getting slightly more competitive, and we may see efforts this session or the next to try to tweak boundary lines again to shore up the people that are currently in those seats. That is not the way a democracy should work. It would be a prime example of the legislators meddling around in the middle, where there's no census to be had, solely for a partisan political outcome. Now, if you are a rational actor as an elected official, and you know that the people that elect you in the only election that matters are in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary, who is your audience? Rationally, your audience is the people that are voting in your primary. And if you're talking about the 10% or so of Republicans or 10% of Democrats who are the types that vote in these elections, namely they're tend to be more ideologically committed and partisan activist types than the general population as a whole. And there's nothing wrong with being a committed activist or a partisan. We need all voices. The problem is that if all you really need to listen to are those extreme voices, then all those in the middle do get lost. And how much harder does that make it to solve any problems that face our country? And that's where it really does become a threat to America's competitiveness at home and abroad, and indeed the very welfare of the people if we have constant bickering based on rational behavior instead of problem solving. This also is problematic in the sense that, going back to what Representative Gardner was saying, drawing unfair maps to reduce minority party representation does silence dissenting voices and shuts a large fraction of the state population out of the political process. So again, that's another reason why, if we want to have a fully functioning democracy, that should concern us.
Great. So next, I think we're going to hear about the Georgia Redistricting Coalition that has come together under the leadership of Common Cause. Brinkley Sidarkitis.
Hey everybody, thanks for being here today. I am Brinkley Circadakis. I'm the Executive Director of I know, it's a challenging last name. I'm the you can practice it as many times as you like. It's always a tough one. I am the Executive Director of Common Cause Georgia, and together with the League of Women Voters and several other groups that are in this room today, including Georgia Equality and the Feminist Women's Health Center, we represent the Georgia Redistricting Alliance. The Alliance came together out of a need to coalesce around the issue of redistricting reform. We are a group of nonpartisan groups who, and of course concerned citizens as well, we welcome participation in the Alliance, no matter who you are, because we see redistricting as an issue that impacts every single Georgian. Certainly it impacts the members and constituents of our organizations that are represented here today. As Representative Gardner and Senator Parent mentioned, it's an issue that is impacting voter choice across the state. It's diminishing competitiveness in our legislative and congressional races. And now is the time to do something about it. 2020 seems like a long way away, but it's actually right around the corner, and we need to go ahead and find a solution to this challenge before the next census rolls around. So the Alliance, again, as a group of nonpartisan organizations and concerned citizens, is so pleased to be here today and stand, side by side with Representative Gardner and Senator Parent as they pre-filed these really important pieces of legislation that we feel, if passed, can create a sustainable, fair solution to map drawing in Georgia. Can restore voter choice, can restore competitive elections so that Georgians have a voice again in their legislature and in Congress. So again, we're thrilled to be here. We are looking forward to a productive session where the Alliance and our partners will be working in conjunction with some of our elected officials to try and get these measures passed and adopted. And we are always welcoming other groups and citizens. We want more voices at the table. This is not a partisan issue. This is a good government issue. This is a democracy reform issue. And we're looking forward to seeing some progress in the 2017 session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly Persons with the League of Women Voters. She's going to tell you a little bit more about the legislation itself.
As I've been introduced, Kelly Persons, I'm the Program and Advocacy Manager for the League of Women Voters of Georgia. This is actually an issue that has been near and dear to our heart for several years, let's say several decades. We know democracy works better when there's more participation. Georgia voters with almost 99% certainty can figure out who's going to win an election based on how the districts are drawn. That's not good for participation, and that's not really good for democracy as a whole. So part of what we're talking about today is how do we sort of take back the pen, for lack of a better word, from those that draw the map and give it back to the citizen, so the citizen is selecting their elected official rather than the elected official drawing around the constituents. My job today is to actually walk you guys through this packet. I'm actually going to walk backwards, so if you'll go with me. One thing that we've been talking about a whole lot has been competitive elections. The math was pretty easy, so we did it for you. We do have numbers from 2014 and 2015 that we gave out last year, so if you need that, please let Brinkley or myself know. We'll be happy to provide that. But the amount of unopposed in general elections is quite shocking, let alone ones that would be considered competitive, which would be a 10-point or less difference between the two candidates. The second piece on the bottom is actually what we call the Standards and Procedures Bill. Essentially, the way that redistricting reform has worked in other states, there's lots of different ideas about how to go about it. The Georgia Redistricting Alliance has looked at other ideas from different states, and we've sort of come up with what we've thought would be the Georgia plan, something that would work for us. Some pieces are modeled after other states, some of them different states at the same time, but that's essentially how we came up with this. Both of these pieces of legislation are constitutional amendments. It will take a constitutional amendment for these reforms to happen. They're two similar ideas. Of course, one can't go forward while the other, we can't have two of these, say, on the ballot at the same time. But we just want to leave it up to the wisdom of the General Assembly to say, these are all these groups who are crying out for redistricting reform. Here's two really good ideas that we think will help Georgia. You help us determine which one is best for us. So the Standard and Procedures Bill would essentially inscribe standards and procedures for each and every time that we draw the maps. They cannot favor or disfavor a political party, an incumbent, and it cannot deny equal opportunity for minority groups. The maps must be of contiguous territory, no more cat splat districts. I know that was a popular one. They have to be compact, and they do have to use existing political and geographical boundaries where they currently exist. It also, very importantly, establishes judicial review. One of the things that we know now is that without the protections of Section 5 of the VRA, there's essentially no referee. There's no one to say, good job, everything's good, these maps should go forward. So essentially, the Standard and Procedures would establish a judicial review through the Georgia Supreme Court, where once the maps are passed, they would go to the Georgia Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would get to say it meets the criteria or it doesn't meet the criteria. If it doesn't meet the criteria, it actually goes back to the General Assembly for one more try. If they can't get it on that second try, it actually goes again to the courts, and they would be the ones responsible for establishing our political boundaries. The Citizens Redistricting Commission, which is the next one, it's a little bit lengthier, a little bit more of a broader process. It would establish a citizens independent redistricting. And it's very important. By independent, we mean that it's independent of the legislature. We actually expect it to be a bipartisan commission, but an independent bipartisan commission. It will have 14 members, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. There's a mechanism for citizens who want to serve on this commission. They would actually apply through the judicial branch. There would be a panel of judges who would actually pre-interview and come up with a pool of applicants that would be willing and able to serve on the commission. They can't be related to anybody who's ran in the last 10 years. There's a whole bunch of stipulations as to who those members can be. And then the members themselves are actually picked by a random drawing. So once we get a sub-pool of the members, we'll actually do a random drawing to staff the commission. The commission itself will be tasked with redrawing all the lines. They must have hearings in every congressional district prior to submitting their maps to the General Assembly. The final maps will go back to the General Assembly for final approval. It'll be a straight up or down, no amendments. If the maps are passed, we're good. We're all under the new maps. If the General Assembly objects to the maps as drawn by the Citizens Commission, the Citizens Commission will again have a second try. If for whatever reason the General Assembly is not happy with the second try, that power would actually revert back to them. However, all of the standards and criteria that the commission would face would also be included if that power does get reverted back to the General Assembly. I know I went through that really fast and some of this is technical. I will take questions sort of here at the end, but one of the things that we just want to emphasize is that we know we can't take politicians out of politics, but we can change who holds the pen. And one of the ways that we can do that is having a citizens independent redistricting commission or at the bare minimum, having standards and procedures that must be followed with that judicial review. I think I'm sort of the closeout for the group, so I will stand for any questions, and if I believe it needs to go to one of the other speakers, I'll point them in the right direction.
I have a question for one of the politicians.
Sure.
Either senator or representative, whether or not if Democrats retake the governor's mansion in 18 and or the legislature in 2020, if they'll stick with this plan, if they have control of the chamber of the legislature.
So your question is, if we elect another Republican governor, do I?
No.
Oh, no,
if
no,
we elect a
if
Democrat.
Democrats win, if Democrats have control.
I will say to you that this is truly nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and we have members of the Democratic caucus who are not willing to sign this bill. We have members of the Republican leadership who are appalled that we're doing this bill. The same people that proposed a very similar proposal back when they were in the minority. So the fact that whoever happens to be in the majority gets to draw the map is not really in question. What is in question is, do we need a better set of standards, a way to ensure that the partisan balance in our state is closer to the voters of the state? I mean, we watched in this last presidential election the Republican candidate get 51% of the votes. That's not the 66% that Senator Parent mentioned earlier. So we have 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate. We don't think it's a fair reflection of the partisan balance in our state. There's been lots of litigation around the Voting Rights Act and the fairness of racial minorities. And we don't anticipate changing that at all. What is new is that some courts are beginning to look at whether we're losing one person, one vote, if one party has such control that there are many people who feel like their votes just don't count.
Thank you.
Right, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, this is not about partisan advantage. I mean, I firmly believe that it's for the betterment of Georgia and for the country for us to have a process that lends itself better to cooperation, the interests of the public, and compromise and problem solving. And so that's something I believe in wholeheartedly, and it would not change if Democrats were in power.
People who are elected are not necessarily in favor of this, but everybody else that I've talked to is.
Right. We you know, in Florida, of course, they were able to get their standards bill that Kelly described through on a voter referendum. And that has happened in a number of states. Other states have independently taken action. But over the recent years, there has been a strong movement towards independent commissions or standards bills or similar other structures in recognition of the fact that the public knows this is a problem and has been demanding change out of this rigged system. And, you know, as Representative Gardner mentioned, the courts also have recognized how detrimental this is and unfair, and have really begun to take action on partisan maps that are unfair for partisan reasons only.
We do not have that referendum process in Georgia, so we think we're going to need legislation, or we're going to have some sort of a lawsuit.
Question is, as a practical matter, since you're in a situation where Democrats have roughly 1/3 of the seats in both chambers, there's really no chance that something like this could get through. Wouldn't you have a better chance of accomplishing what you're trying to do by filing a federal court lawsuit? That seems to me a more effective way of accomplishing what you want to do.
One of the things that I believe is that most voters don't really understand why there's this unfair environment.
Mm-hmm.
So a big piece of what we're trying to do is get people interested in how this happens. I mean, people are frustrated that they don't feel like their votes count. But they, you know, other than the Electoral College, don't really understand the conditions and the processes that are in place that make it impossible for their vote to matter. So, do we think this is gonna pass this session? Well, probably, it's a bit of a long shot, Tom.
Sure.
Well, I mean, here's several, reasons that I think it's very important for the majority party to consider this legislation. Number one, the public is strongly in favor and demands it. Number two, as Georgia becomes more and more competitive in statewide elections, it would behoove them to not have Democrats be in charge of drawing the maps for their sole partisan interest the way the Republicans did last time. So that would be a very good reason that they might want to take a hard look. The third reason is, of course, the rapid advancement in the courts and the notion that this may come anyway. And yes, we certainly agree that a lawsuit is a good idea. We intend to fight on all fronts.
North Carolina's an example of that.
Right. Yeah. We actually have a lawyer here who works with Common Cause who's been involved in some of those lawsuits around the country, who'd be able to speak to the pressure for the kind of lawsuit that you're talking about. But meanwhile, we really need the citizens, the voters, to be educated on what the process is like and what we can do to make it feel more fair to all of us.
From the aspect of the alliance itself, we agree that this is a long shot, but we're also on the first of a 2-year session. We sort of saw it with OSD, that individuals decided to let the people decide. We're hoping that may be one of the messages, that even if leadership may or may not agree with it on both sides of the aisle, I think you'll find some people that are surprisingly with us on the principle and the matter. It's just how does that function? What does that look like? So we are hopeful. Maybe not this year, maybe the year after, it can at least go to the people for them to decide what's right for Georgia. We saw it with OSD, and again, we're going to keep plowing that same ground. But we do actually have bipartisan support on the principle itself. Any other questions?
Like how much bipartisan support? Specifically from Republicans?
So on the principal idea, we've had support on previous bills that we've done. The Georgia Redistricting Alliance is actually, I've been part of it since 2011. We had a similar bill last year that actually received a hearing in both I believe the House and the Senate, if not just the Senate. But it seems like the Redistricting Committee is at least interested in these ideas. They had very robust questions for us, and it was more about how does this mechanism work. That doesn't mean after these last elections that attitude may or may not have changed, but we know on principle there are individuals that stand with us, and it's a matter of what does that mechanism look like? What is the best plan for Georgia moving forward?
And the bill that I introduced last year actually did have a Republican sponsor. That's it? No more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you guys very much.
We're here to ask you, the press, to help us educate the voters. I mean, this is why we're here. We think it's time for people to know how important the census is. It's important that every person be counted when that census taker comes around. And we know that the numbers are moving in the direction of a better partisan balance in our state, and we need to take advantage of that in the next redistricting process. So I'm counting on you in the press to help us with that initiative. And thank you very much for being here today.